It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us is Matthew Dalton, reporter at the Paris bureau of the Wall Street Journal. How are things?
Pretty good, Francois.
Pretty good.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that my colleague Evan Gershkovich is still in prison. His detention was prolonged for another 2 months. So before his trial.
Trial in Moscow.
In Moscow, that's right. And so he'll have been in prison for more than a year by the time his trial begins on completely unfounded and absurd allegations of espionage. And so it's I just wanted to highlight what he's going through, and we're just hoping that he gets out as soon as possible.
All right, well, thanks for flagging that. Vaiju Naravane is Paris correspondent for The Wire and the Hindustan Times. Welcome to the show. How are things?
Great.
Great. Oh, wow. Okay, so they've gone from pretty good to great. Agnès Poirier, London correspondent for L'Express, is with us as well. How's your week been?
Not bad.
Not bad. Okay. So it's a mixed bag. We'll be crossing over to France 24 Jerusalem correspondent Iris Machler, who will be joining our conversation shortly. Before we do, just to tell us, you can listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services.
The court considers that it cannot accede to Israel's request that the case be removed from the general list.
It's the beginning, not the end, for South Africa's complaint before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The court finding that Israel's got to report back in a month. It must, in the meantime, prevent genocidal acts in Gaza and allow humanitarian aid in. Stopping short, though, of calling for a ceasefire. A win nonetheless, argues South Africa's foreign minister.
The saving of life is not merely with respect to having a ceasefire. It's to ensuring that humanitarian aid is provided to those who need support, as well as ensuring that the state of Israel, which is currently the occupier and administrator in Palestine, provides the necessary basic services that the residents of Gaza and the West Bank require.
Matthew Dalton, your reaction to what you just heard there about whether it's a win or a loss, if you will. I don't know if that's how you qualify such a ruling.
Well, I think it was expected in the sense that legal experts didn't think that the court was going to order a ceasefire for Israel. After all, it was Hamas that attacked Israel, starting this war. Israel then retaliated and invaded the Gaza Strip. The court did, for example, order a ceasefire of Russia's invasion of Ukraine because that was an unprovoked invasion. That said, the order to avoid genocide and as this operation continues is going to hang over Israel as it proceeds, and what looks like it's going to be a very long military operation.
So carrying moral weight is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's something that the eyes of the world are even more on Israel. There's even more scrutiny of this operation and what Israel's facing right now is that there's still thousands of Hamas militants in the Gaza Strip. The Western governments estimate that less than half of the Hamas's militants have been killed or taken out of operations. So this war, from Israel's perspective, if its goal is really to eliminate Hamas, as Netanyahu said was the goal of Israel, is very far from being over. And now the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is only getting worse. So this puts a lot of scrutiny, a lot of pressure on Israel as it manages this war.
Pressure on Israel, and of course the Prime Minister responding in kind.
Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. Equally unwavering is our sacred commitment to continue to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, Israel has an inherent right to defend itself. The vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. The charge of genocide leveled against Israel is not only false, it's outrageous and decent people everywhere should reject it.
And again, the court did not rule on genocide in this particular case, Agnès Poirier.
Well, it's only the first step in a very long, time-consuming and nuanced process. I mean, it will take years for the final ruling to take place. And, you know, it must have been very difficult for the 17 judges of the International Court of Justice. And in a way, I mean, they were walking on eggshells, but it's a delicate balance, but it's a fine balance because both sides can claim victory in a way because they rejected South Africa's request that Israel suspend immediately all military operations, but it also rejected Israel's request that the case be thrown out. It is asking Israel to limit harm to Palestinians, but in the end, you know, Palestinians. I mean, you can question, of course, South Africa's motives in that, suitcase at the ICJ. But Palestinians have, victory in the sense that, as you said, there is mounting international pressure. Also, for all the Western allies of Israel, it puts increased pressure, which they've been applying on Israel for some time now, that a solution be found, especially as the fighting is bogged down in Gaza. But of course, there's Netanyahu, and basically it looks as if the situation is frozen, and there's more than 100 hostages still in Gaza, and the Red Sea is now blocked. Egypt is playing a more important role in trying to release the hostages and to find a ceasefire for a few weeks or a few months. Everybody is working on it, but
certainly what we see before the cameras. We just heard that clip of Benjamin Netanyahu, which is that Israel does not carry out genocide, does not systematically, and takes precautions when it's fighting in Gaza. Well, there's a different take on that characterization. Listen to this resident of the southern Gaza city of Rafah speaking on Thursday.
The Israelis say they send prior warnings before strikes, but they don't. The strike hit us all of a sudden. 6 people that are, however, not members of my family were martyred. They were 2 inside the mosque, 1 just outside it, and 3 displaced Gazans, a father and his 2 grandchildren.
Yeah, it's the optics of what's been unfolding for now more than 100 days, Vaidu Naravani.
Oh, absolutely. And the situation is very, very serious. In fact, the ruling by the court is going to help other Western countries like the US or France, Germany, who've been trying to put pressure on Israel to say, listen, go for a ceasefire, and also think of the ultimate solution, in a sense, to the whole question of 2 states, Palestine, the rights of the Palestinian people, which Netanyahu so far has stoutly decided not to do. And this is going to say, all right, you're being watched. And it's very difficult also for Israel to lead this kind of invasion, this campaign, without the number of casualties that they're having, which is incredible and huge. Is Israel going to able to heed what the court has asked it to do and really go in for the so-called surgical strikes or, targeted attacks against particular targets is going to prove very difficult. But this does strengthen, in a sense, the hands of all those countries which have been trying to persuade Israel to stop or go in for a ceasefire or whatever.
Events in The Hague, events in New York, events in Gaza. They've been making for a busy day for our Jerusalem correspondent, Iris Makler, who joins us now. Thanks for joining us here in The World This Week, Iris. The court in The Hague urging Israel to take all measures in its power to prevent genocidal acts and to stop officials for making declarations that incite to genocide. However, there was a disparaging tweet. Hague Schmeig from far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. Your thoughts on, you just heard there a moment ago, Vaiju talking about the pressure increasing. Is that pressure going to increase?
I think the pressure is increasing because we have an other than Itamar Ben-Gvir's characteristic tweet. In fact, I'm only surprised he didn't say more to dismiss the judgment, freshly off the presses. That we have heard a call from Israel's National Security Organization Council calling on ministers not to say anything. No public response at all. Thank you very much. And what we have heard from Israeli analysts is that really this should have been the position from the beginning, from the start, for Netanyahu to take that mantra or that thought for himself and to discipline the variety of ministers in his party and beyond it who are in his government and made these incendiary comments. So now, if they only do it at the behest of the ICJ, so the analysts in Israel are saying, then at least, that's one achievement of the International Court of Justice.
And every week we wonder, is it coming to a head because it's over soon, or is it never ending amid moves to secure a ceasefire? We've seen this week's, you've had the encircling of Han Yunis, the largest city in southern Gaza. That's triggered heavy fighting, and for Israelis, there was that shock of 27 reservists killed when the building they were in collapsed after a rocket-propelled grenade attack. According to the New York Times, Iris, they were part of an operation to clear a buffer zone along the border between Israel and Gaza.
Yes, I think that's something that Israel says not to the public, but certainly to Washington. And that's how we hear it from American sources, that that's part of the plan, that the fence that they had built to separate between the south of Israel and Gaza obviously wasn't effective enough, and that this would be one step that Israel plans. But, this whole question of what will the day after look like and what Israel's plans are, it's kind of very foggy. You don't actually know because Israel's Prime Minister doesn't want to have that discussion in public, or even, it seems, really in the cabinet either. It's like Henry Kissinger said, if you don't know where you're going, all roads lead nowhere. And I think that's part of the problem that Israel faces.
Yeah, well, so what do you make, for instance, there was this hot mic incident where Benjamin Netanyahu disparaged the Qataris who are trying to broker a ceasefire.
Yeah, and it wasn't just hot mic. He was also quoted or taped by members of the hostages' families who he made that comment to. It's very hard to determine what game he is playing if you don't look or add the factor of his own survival to it, his own political survival. Because at many points along this road, when it's a question of choosing Washington or choosing this right-wing, extremist right-wing coalition, it must be said, that he heads, he's chosen them and his own political survival because he actually has enough votes without them. But those votes, those are the people who've joined this government since this war, but they aren't likely to stay. They aren't likely to support him forever. So he goes back to the people who will, or who he believes will, and that's a very dangerous situation for Israel, actually.
And yes, Paul.
Well, yes. I mean, Israel, the world wants to know what is Israel's strategy. But the country's strategy is linked to Netanyahu's political survival. There's also this other question: how long can a war cabinet last? It's an emergency war cabinet, but it cannot last for months and months and months. At some point, the centrist partners will want, what is the future strategy? What about
But haven't
Palestine?
we been saying this? Haven't we been saying this for months now?
Yes. There are talks of perhaps elections, because you need to renew the trust in the leader. And of course, Netanyahu owes his return to power last year to the far right. At some point, something is going to give.
But as long as the war is going on, Netanyahu has the argument that, well, we can't change horses in mid-war. We've got to, I'm running things right now. So it does perversely kind of create an incentive to continue
the war is not going anywhere. It's not as if something was achieved.
Well, he has said
but
his goal, he has said, is the destruction, the complete elimination of Hamas, and who knows how long that will take. And if that's an argument that he's going to keep pressing, then maybe his position is, well, we can't have a reckoning for my president in my prime ministership, because that's something that's coming as well. And the huge security failures that happened on October 7th, he's going to have to answer for those at some point.
Sounds like his job is safe, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Well, it's also interesting to see how long people like Benny Gantz and the other centrists who've actually joined this war cabinet, who've been quite steadfast in a sense in supporting Netanyahu, or at least not publicly criticizing him. How long are they going to be able to last? At what point do they decide, no, this has gone on too far, we are walking out? Because already calls for the holding of elections are growing. The hostage families are really at the end of their tether. So within Israel also, a situation is boiling up little by little. It's getting hotter and hotter. So there has to come a tipping point. Now, how far that tipping point is, we can't really say.
What is the tipping point? What will the tipping point be, Iris Makler?
Oh, Francois, how can I predict that? I can only look and say to you that I see increasing amounts of stress with the families and spreading out from them. The most common thing anyone says to me when I ask ordinary Israelis, wherever I meet them, I say, what do you want? And they all say, we want a new face to this government. I'd rather have people who have no experience and they can learn on the job than this lot. So there's definitely a move amongst people for change. And there's also a feeling that, it's expressed over and over again, what we've just been saying in the studio, this fear that Netanyahu is placing his personal interests above the interests of the state. That 53% of people asked that question in a poll said, yes, we don't think he's placing our interests above his own. So that's a bad look for a prime minister, any prime minister anywhere. So I think you're right when you say it'll bubble along. Where the tipping point will be, or the explosion will be, it might actually be around the issue of the hostages. Because if no deal is done and something trickles out that the deal wasn't done because of the right-wing parties in that coalition, and if in that case the centrists leave, that really would be an explosion.
Something to watch. On a happier note for India, we can say happy 75th. Like the French, they love a parade for Republic Day, a military parade. And just as Prime Minister Narendra Modi was guest of honor on Bastille Day last year, a French contingent invited to march in Delhi, while their commander-in-chief watched from the review stand. There was, of course, as well, the announcements, Vaiju Naravane, of deals for building helicopters and jet engines. And on the quiet, Republic Day is also about India pivoting away from its main supplier of weapons in the past, Russia.
Yes, well, France has begun to occupy a bigger and bigger position. There are three main suppliers to India. One of them is Israel, which is why also the Modi government hasn't come out with any kind of criticism about Gaza or what's been happening there. They're sort of walking on eggs. That's the same thing with Russia and Ukraine. Have you ever heard direct criticism of the attack against Ukraine by the Russians? Because they're one of the three main suppliers of arms along with France. And Macron wasn't the first choice. In fact, Modi was snubbed by the Americans. They had asked Joe Biden to be the guest of honor, and he turned down and refused, partly because there are reports in the American Congress, and there's a lot of concern in America about India going the majoritarian, extreme right-wing nationalist Hindu way, with a lot of actions against the Muslim minority and other minorities. Hinduism has almost been raised to the status of national religion, although India's constitution is a secular one. But the current party in power with Modi, who's been in power for 10 years, has increasingly placed Hinduism, and with that, everything else that goes with it, a kind of reactionary mindset, belief in superstition, constructions of temples. And this temple has been erected on
let's talk about that. Emmanuel Macron going where Joe Biden did not, to India, just 4 days after a controversial inauguration. Macron kicking off in Jaipur, historic, the capital of Rajasthan, the scene where there was a motorcade with Narendra Modi. The two leaders, he also went, Macron, to the Amber Fort, a reminder of a rich heritage there. There you see that motorcade. But there was, as Vaiju was mentioning, 3 days previous, India's Prime Minister consecrating the unfinished Ayodhya temple, a shrine to the deity Ram, that's long been a promise of Hindu nationalists ever since 1992, when they tore down the Mughal-era mosque that stood on the same site.
Our Ram has arrived. After centuries of waiting, our Ram has arrived. Centuries of unprecedented patience, countless sacrifices and penance. Our Lord Ram has arrived.
After centuries of waiting. And you're saying that's why Joe Biden decided not to go?
One of the reasons, because also India has been trying very hard to get into the good books of the Americans, to change the image that India was pro-Moscow. And you know, this whole thing about wanting to contain China, becoming the favored partner of the Americans in order to contain China, that still hasn't completely materialized, although India is part of the Quad.
Narendra Modi got a state dinner at the White House. I mean, it's
yes, that's true. I mean, the relations between the two countries are very close, and Modi has brought India much, much closer to America. But yet there seems to be a degree of hesitation, because the manner in which Modi was rebuffed with his invitation to the Republic Day startled quite a few people. And they're wondering what the reasons for it was. I think a lot of Americans do frown upon this extreme right-wing Hindu nationalist turn that India has taken, because we used to say India and America are similar in that we accommodate every stripe, every religion, every
But Joe Biden knew that when he welcomed Narendra Modi. It's the same Narendra Modi that came to the White House.
True, but then going there just a couple of days after the inauguration of this temple, with millions of Indians thronging the streets going there, is a different cup of tea.
Matthew Dalton.
Well, there's also this suspicion that India was behind a plot to assassinate a Sikh separatist in the United States, and that it did assassinate a Sikh separatist in Canada. So those two things, those were two big events that have really troubled U.S.-India relations. It's also worth remembering about France's relationship with India is that, if you remember, a few years ago, France had this deal with Australia to sell Australia a bunch of submarines. It was part of a big geostrategic agreement between the two countries, and then the Australia ditched the agreement secretly without telling France and signed a submarine deal with the U.S. and with the U.K. The French foreign minister said it was a stab in the back. And so now France is looking for another partner in the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region, as kind of a counter to China. And India is one of the main candidates for that. So France is really looking forward to selling submarines, selling fighter jets, selling all kinds of stuff, including nuclear reactors to India. It's got a whole program that it hopes can pick up some of the slack that was left by this snub from Australia.
Of course, Iris Makler, the Australian Prime Minister on whose watch all that happened, announced this week he was retiring from politics. Your thoughts when you listened there to Vaidyu Naravane talk about how India, the way it positions itself on the world stage when you have things like the war in Ukraine and what's going on where you are?
It is interesting, the strong relationship that Narendra Modi has built up with Israel. He's been here, he's a big supporter, and he places himself with Israel, with Russia, with the US. You can say, despite what Viju has called these extremist religious views, he's actually playing a good hand of politics, wouldn't you say?
Of course, when we talk about reasons for not going to Republic Day, just another one, a simpler one might just be, Agnès Poirier, that India's having elections. They take place in April, and it's perhaps a little bit close, and you don't want your visit to be seen as a political endorsement. Yet Macron did not refuse. He went.
Yes, well, it seems to me, having seen, over the years, Modi and Macron, they seem to have a sort of a personal good relationship. I mean, between a relationship that goes beyond the realpolitik, because this trip that has been organized in just 40 days, which is nothing, for those kind of official visits, especially when you know how long it takes to negotiate contracts so that they are signed during the official visit. And so, of course, there's a lot of realpolitik, you mentioned.
And the French are always concerned, saying, why are the Indians not investing in France? Because now the Indians they invest more abroad than the investments they get into India, which is a very new phenomenon.
Well, to plant the seeds of that, there was one announcement made. Right now, there's some 10,000 Indians who come to study here in France. And the same week that they've been talking about this controversial immigration bill, the French pledging they would triple that number.
Yes, it's very, you have this kind of double-bind communication coming out from this government. On the one hand, the immigration bill says, we are going to limit the number of students and the visas that you give to the students. And on the other hand, Macron goes and says, you've got to triple the number of Indian students who come to France. We don't know how that is going to square up.
Will they come?
I don't know. The language barrier is very strong, although schools like Sciences Po and others are now teaching in English. There are more students. More schools. Yes, there are students who are coming to France. But at the same time, France must understand that it's huge degrees. Even degrees from Sciences Po are not considered to be prize degrees compared to Harvard or Princeton or any of the British universities. So the French also have a big effort to make into making those degrees internationally viable and valuable. So that's another thing.
All right, Emmanuel Macron, who is going to be segging from pageantry to pitchforks. He's returning to a farmers' revolt, tractors this Friday, converging on Paris ahead of the government's announcement of a farm bill to streamline paperwork. And in scenes reminiscent of Wednesday in Warsaw or last week in Berlin, French agricultural workers more and more fuming mad. Here you see them. They've been spraying manure earlier in the week on the préfecture, the state superintendent's office. This was in the southwestern town of Agen. Since COVID, farmers have felt the squeeze of inflation and the law of, there you see that manure being sprayed, dwindling margins imposed by distributors and supermarket chains.
We can't do it anymore. We are at our wits' end. That's why we're here, to make ourselves heard a bit. And I hope we'll make people understand our distress.
Okay, so we've had announcements that have just come out from France's new prime minister, and among them, the scrapping of a bid to phase out the subsidy for agricultural diesel.
We
decided to put agriculture above all else. Above all else. This is an important day for French agriculture, for the farming world, for our farmers here, in the Occitanie region and throughout France. Farmers are waiting for what I'm going to tell you today, because everyone wants to move forward, continuing to talk to each other, knowing how to put agriculture above everything else. That's what my two ministers are here to say today.
Still takes getting used to. He's 34 years old, the agriculture minister. Your reaction to the prime minister, your reaction to what you just heard there from Gabriel Attal?
Well, it's, he's in a dangerous position, but things will be really agreed or changed or in Brussels, because it's a European problem more than a French problem.
Because the streamlining of the red tape, the easing off on environmental norms, perhaps?
No, that is true. I mean, French farmers, but I'm sure it's the plight of many farmers in Europe, have said that a day every week is taken by bureaucracy, filling in forms for France, but also European papers, etc. So, I mean, this is what Gabriel Attal can try and do. That is to say,
certainly what he's promising,
decreasing the bureaucracy. But frankly, what is at stake goes far beyond bureaucracy. It's about the future of agriculture. I mean, after decades of intensive farming agreed on in Brussels and France benefiting, I think it's almost 8 billion euros a year, and it's the biggest country to get, or rather, it's the biggest share that French agriculture is getting from Brussels. And now we want farmers, of course, to depollute the rivers, the soil, the air. It's going to cost more subsidies to help them transition. But at the same time, it's, there are so many contradictions in Europe when Brussels is also asking for more food to be produced. This is not possible if you start polluting, if you want a more ecological, viable agriculture. It means less food and also more expensive food. So I think, farmers have a lot to answer to, especially pig farms in France and the big cereals. I mean, they are responsible for a lot of pollution in France. So they need to look at themselves and what they've been doing. Europe has to do that as well, France as well, and consumers.
Right. So the common agricultural policy, which is basically the EU subsidy scheme, still the biggest line item in the European Union's budget. Matthew Dalton, you just heard Agnès expose the problem. If they want to reform it, if they want to make it more conditional on a more sustainable way of growing food, well, what the French farmers are complaining about is, we'll do it, but then we're going to be undercut by the competition, and we're already being squeezed by the big distributors, by the supermarket chains.
Well, Macron kind of ran into this problem earlier in his presidency with the Gilets jaunes, that whole episode with the people coming out, the rolling protests that ground the country to a halt for months and months, more than a year, it seemed like, was due to an effort to raise the tax on fuel.
It was sparked by a carbon tax.
Right. It was sparked by a carbon tax. Same issue with the cost of fuel, and this is something that I think Macron's government, his various governments, have been kind of blind to the issues that rural France is facing. In rural France, people need their cars. They have no alternative but to drive in many places. And so the cost of those measures is very expensive for them. Likewise, farmers, there's no alternative for agricultural diesel right now. There's no switch they can do. It's something that it is an unavoidable cost for them. So, the government probably has to be thinking a little bit more closely about those issues that are facing the French countryside. Even though it's true that French farmers, like farmers in the United States, farmers across Europe, do get a lot of subsidies. I mean, they get plenty of government help. the kind of the biggest recipients of government welfare by some estimates.
But they've been killed by inflation, is what they've told us. You know, we spoke with one farmer who was in the center of France in Thursday's show, and he just says since COVID, they just can't make ends meet.
Yeah, you need the subsidies to keep farms in business. That's true. I mean, if the common agricultural policy didn't exist, you'd have all of that grain, so much more imports coming from America, coming from South America. So it's something that's necessary, but it is costly.
When you report on this story for India, because you had big farmers' protests there, Vaidya Naravane, what do they make of the how should I say, hot-blooded way in which, I mean, we saw those images of the manure being sprayed on the prefecture in Agen.
Well, there was a delegation from Europe who went to India to look at the state of Indian farming, and they asked one farmer, what would you like to be reborn as under your system of remigration of souls? And he says, I'd like to be born as a European cow because I have all the subsidies in the world, I'm well looked after and totally protected, unlike my skinny cattle in India. So yes, even in India, the farm lobby has been very strong. This is the only lobby that has been able to make Modi turn back 3 proposed farm laws. So 3 farm laws that had been actually legislated upon had to be withdrawn because of very strong protests by Indian farmers. But sometimes the problems are the same. It's like waterlogging of farms, the overproduction of nitrogen, the destruction of soils and the aquifers. So how are you going to balance that? And of course, the French have been very protected because during COVID, it was these subsidies from the European Union that allowed France to continue to be well nourished and receive all the food that it required during COVID times. They didn't have to go scrabbling around elsewhere, unlike other countries in Europe. So on the one hand, this has been a successful policy for the French, but on the other hand, how are you going to counterbalance it with your environmental norms and objectives?
Right, and despite the roadblocks, the manure toss, the trashing of the public property, 0 arrests, and that, well, it's irked environmentalists.
You had the Dernière Rénovation climate protest block a highway for 15 minutes. They end up in custody and the court cases pile up. In this case, if environmentalists did 1,000th of what's going on today, they'd be in prison and sentenced.
And strangely enough, France's law and order interior minister seems to agree.
I have confidence in farmers. I know their profession is a difficult one, essential for the French, and if they ever respect the rules of the Republic, and I know they do so because they are patriots, there is no reason for the police or gendarmerie to intervene.
How do you say pandering in French? I mean, that's surprising, isn't it? He's openly saying, yes, they can throw that manure, they won't face any consequences.
It's interesting because in a way, that's what the Interior Minister had to say 20 or 40 years ago because farmers represented a force to be reckoned with. There was nothing you could do against them. They ruled the day. Today, farmers...
Unlike students.
But farmers today actually don't represent that many people.
But the French all love their peasant roots, right?
From time to time.
We all think we are proud of our heritage.
Yes and no, because it's a bit of a myth when I often go to Brittany and pig farms are responsible for so much polluting. Every river in Brittany is completely poisoned with fertilizers. So I think as we become more ecologically conscious, then we realize that farmers need to transition, need to do better, smaller. Perhaps we need to help them. And we also need, I'll say that again, because a chicken today, if you go to a supermarket, it costs what in France? About €7. And it costs 10 times that just after the war. We will need to pay more for food so that farmers are paid a decent wage. I mean, we're all part of this discussion, really.
Yeah.
The another thing is that the union that we see, that FNSR, which represents cereal farmers, and they are amongst the wealthiest of the farmers. They don't have very much to complain, actually.
And the biggest polluters.
It's the cattle lobby, which has had suicides and where people have not been. It's cattle farmers and animal breeders who've had problems. It's not so much the cereal lobby, but they're the ones who are the most organized, the wealthiest, with the loudest voices.
Yeah, and earlier in the week, what we saw there, that exchange between one of the leaders of the Green Party and the Interior Minister, well, that kind of presages the fact that we have European elections coming up. Earlier this week, the president of the party of far-right leader Marine Le Pen, he visited the Brittany port of Lorient, Jordan Bardella, surfing a wave, you might say, of anger over a fishing ban during breeding season for dolphins and porpoises along the Atlantic coast. Matthew Dalton, if this is pitted as an argument of city folk versus country folk, the far right wins?
Well, I think it's a kind of argument that helps, the Rassemblement National, I think. You look at, go back to the Gilets jaunes again, this is a significant chunk of the Gilets jaunes were supporters of the far right. It was kind of like a coalition of the far left and the far right, but probably more the far right. And now you have these issues of environmental issues that are really impacting rural France, both the fishing, you've got the diesel issue. So this is kind of the coalition, I think, that the Rassemblement National is trying to assemble. It's outside of the cities for the most part. It's in industrial areas. It's in rural France. And if they can kind of just get a few more, they came thinking about the presidential election in a number of years. They came very close last time, pretty close. And if they can just expand that coalition a little more, maybe make a few more inroads into the industrial areas, into maybe even the suburban areas of the big French cities,
right.
Then Marine Le Pen will be president.
Well, we'll see. The election campaign is just beginning for those European elections in June. Nothing's more subjective than awards season. In Los Angeles, nominations out for the Academy Awards, a few short years after a boycott campaign against the underrepresentation of women at the Oscars. This time, a record 3 movies directed by women are up for Best Picture. But elsewhere, there was one notable absentee.
For achievement in directing, the nominees are Justine Triet, Anatomy of a Fall; Martin Scorsese, Killers of the Flower Moon; Christopher Nolan, Oppenheimer; Yorgos Lanthimos, Poor Things; and Jonathan Glazer, The Zone of Interest.
So there you have it, Iris Mockler. No Greta Gerwig for Best Director, even though it's her direction that made quirky box office smash Barbie such a success. By the way, no Best Actress nomination for Margot Robbie. Is the only one of the big ones. You have Best Supporting Actor going for Ryan Gosling as Ken.
That's right. Someone said, which I did agree with, Ken gets the only award. That's the entire film, the entire movie in one event. And it is, I guess, she wasn't just the director. She was also the writer, the creator, Greta Gerwig, of course. It was her idea. She took something that no one wanted and no one wanted to fund, and she had to fund partly herself, wrote it with her partner. So for all of those reasons, given what a box office smash it was, you'd think she'd get a look in, but no.
Your thoughts on this?
Well, it was very surprising, especially since Greta Gerwig is such a talented director. Everybody remembers her Little Women, which was absolutely sensational. But somehow, I think They have decided that because Mattel was perhaps involved and they had the approval of Mattel for the making of the Barbie movie, they'd much rather not take chances with that corporate pat on the back, which she got.
Well, we'll see what happens when the Best Picture category comes along. Now, you did hear in that list the name of Justine Triet, the 45-year-old French woman garnering 5 Oscar nominations after winning the Cannes Film Festival's Golden Palm, the Golden Globe for Best Foreign Film for her stirring courtroom drama, Anatomy of a Fall. France, though, didn't submit the movie for Best Foreign Film at the Academy Awards. One can only wonder if there's a link to her acceptance speech at Cannes, smack in the middle of pension reform protests, where she told the audience the commercialization of culture that the neoliberal government defends is the process of shattering France's cultural exception. Do you think that the French snubbed her, Agnès Poirier, because of that speech? And
no, what she said at the in Cannes was crass and I think ridiculous, but that's not the reason why her film, which is excellent, was not chosen. There are many different, I mean, they don't have to go for the Palme d'Or winner. They made another choice. We should talk about that choice. It has had a different English title. It's called The Taste of Things. In French, it has this impossible title.
It's a beautiful movie.
It's The Passion of Dodin Bouffant. I think the title in French, it's so.
So they weren't punishing Justine Triet.
No, because The Passion of Dodin Bouffant, The Taste of Things in English, is a fantastic film.
Okay.
And it was not a box office success. It did have the Best Director's Prize. I need to talk more about this film, please. And
we're out of time, though.
It's a Franco-Vietnamese director, and it's a pity, of course, it's not nominated for Best Foreign Film. But Justine Triet should be, so happy.
Yeah, 5 nominations, including Best Picture. So we'll see how it plays out.
Great movie.
Agnès Poirier, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Matthew Dalton, Vaiju Naravane, Iris Mockler in Jerusalem. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.